So we just here a little bit. So the topic today, as it was advertised, is why was sin permitted? The plan of redemption. So if Elizabeth, if you had put it up, would appreciate it.
Do you want me to control it or do you want to control
Oh, I have to do it.
it? You can, yeah, if you want
Okay.
to.
Yeah, okay, fine. Why was sin permitted? So there are two words I wanted us to talk about today. One word is sin, and the other word is implied. By why was sin permitted? If you think about why was sin permitted, who do you think is implied permitted sin? God. So if you forget everything else, we're going to talk today about two concepts. God, what is your image of God, and sin. What is sin and what are the consequences of sin? So with that in mind, let's start first with setting the stage, is what I call it. Who was doing the permitting? God was doing the permitting. We have two levels of understanding of God. We have what we call the doctrinal affirmation. If you ask any Christian, well, who is God? You'll get biblical text. God is love. God is grace. God is gracious. Those are the ideas of God. But the literature says that there is another understanding, our personal picture, your personal and private image of God. And your personal and private image of God is really the sum of your thoughts and your feelings, the memories of your emotional experiences, the images of your mother's face, of your father's presence. It shapes your personal image and picture of God. Keep that in mind as we unpack it a little bit, because I want us to think about that. So here is a quote from a book that I recently read. It's entitled Rule Makers and Rule Breakers. It's 11 p.m. in Berlin. Not a single car is in sight. Yet, pedestrian waits patiently at a crosswalk until the light turns green. Meanwhile, 4,000 miles away in Boston, at rush hour, commuters flout the do not cross sign as they dart in front of cabs. And she says, behavior, it turns out, is largely depends on whether we live in a tight or a loose culture. Tight cultures have strong social norms and little tolerance for deviance, while loose cultures have weak social norms and are highly permissive. The former are rule makers, the latter are rule breakers. Your private image of God is influenced by the culture you grew up in. Carolyn grew up in a rule-making home. There was love, but with rules. As a tight culture. I grew up in a loose home. My mother used to ask the Lord for 5 minutes so she could tell you what she thought about you in the appropriate language that she thought God would not approve of. Oh, you were going to say something?
A German food service engineer designed all of the food prep facilities on the main Orlando campus and got to know him well. Yes, in their home, and got to know him well enough that at one time I said, Walter, help me understand this. I said, all of the German people I've interacted with are kind and considerate. I said, how could things have possibly happened the way they did during the Holocaust and the war? And he said, you know, this isn't an excuse. He said, but the culture at that time is you did what you were told by your parents, by your teachers, by the folk in authority, and you never questioned authority. You just did what you were told.
Type culture.
Type culture.
And so your personal image, every one of us is shaped by our parents, by our early experiences, and by the culture in which we live. So here's what she says. Tight, loose differences emerge in boardrooms, classrooms, bedrooms, around negotiating tables and dinner tables. So Carolyn and I have many discussions where I say, honey, it was just a suggestion. And she said, sweetheart, it is the law. So my father had a very prominent nose and a bald head. And I would call him old man. I would pull his nose and tap him on his head. Last thing I did before he died. If God has a large nose, let you think what I might try to do. Because that's my personal picture. Come from a loose culture. So now, let's pause a little bit and think. Think of Bible characters. And try to tell me what you think was their image of God. When you think of a Bible character, I'll prime the pump. And the one I'll tell you is the steward that had one talent. What did he say when he came with his one talent back to Jesus?
You were a tough master.
He said, I knew you're a taskmaster, a harsh one, reaping where you haven't served. I've protected the talent and I'm bringing it back. That was his private image of God.
Daniel, I think he saw God as his protector.
Right? Yes. Very good. Anyone else? Yes.
Well, David was clearly a rule breaker, and yet God says, hey, here's my guy, a man after my own heart. Like, what?
Yes.
Stories of the Good Samaritan, the priest and the ruler that came by first, they seemed harsh. They just walked by.
And Jesus said, that's not the image of God you should have. You should have. Elijah, his was a still small voice. That's what he heard. Kelly, you were going to, I thought you were going to. Anyone else? Have you?
I think the illustration of the servant, I think Jesus was playing their tune. That was the mistaken image of God that the listeners had. But you compare that to the woman caught in adultery. Jesus said, I don't condemn you. There are interesting contrasts there.
Yes. So we've studied Philip Yancey for the last 8 weeks or so. What do you think Philip Yancey's personal concept of God is?
I think it changed over time.
Probably changed over time. That's another point too. Thank you. It changes as we mature and change. But what do you think it is or today? And I always have a lot of fun when I listen to someone and I think about them. And I wonder what their concept. I was pastoring a small church, and there was a woman who was the organist, and she wore a wedding ring. And the church members were very offended that I allowed her to play the organ because she was wearing a wedding ring. Now, she was an Adventist and her husband was not, and she felt that it made sense to wear a wedding ring. What do you think their image of God was that they were objecting?
Probably an image of God that I largely grew up with, and that he was in the business of keeping people out of heaven instead of doing everything to get them in.
I remember when I first read Thomas Cahill's books about the gifts of the Jews and stuff, and he really painted a picture of a God from the Jewish perspective, someone you could argue with, like you can debate the Abraham, you could have this conversation. I later went to law school with a lot of Jewish people and learned that more. But yeah, that had never struck me that God was someone that, you really had a back and forth. He was interested in how your brain was thinking about things. That was new for me.
So I had a friend last week visiting, and he's traveled quite a bit, and he talks about the mountains, and he cycles, and he's out in nature. And I said, he was in Nepal, and it's kind of like, for me, I'm thinking mountains, they're nice, they're pretty, they're okay. Are there any markets? I like to shop. What's it like? Think about Abraham for a moment, and we haven't forgotten Yancy, because I like to bargain. So for me, I think Abraham had a bargaining concept of God. Remember Sodom? What about if there's 50? Okay, what about if there's 40? What about if there's 30? We have our unique concept. So what do you think Yancey's concept was? And I mean, I just have a lot of fun listening to people and then trying to divine, well, what is his concept of God that's leading him to say this? Now, Christ said, don't get too petty. He talked about people who were paying tithe of mint and anise and cumin and omitting the weightier matters of judgment and mercy and justice. And he was really saying, what is your concept of God? What do you think Yancey's concept is? I mean, we don't know for sure. We've listened to him.
I think that it's amazing when you read his book about his life, that he even remained a Christian. Amazing.
I think there were two things that struck me. I'll give it to you. One was the silence of God. I think if you read the chapters in the book we read, everyone, he comes back to that theme, recurring silence of God. That's what he read into the lives of those people. And then he also read about the fatherhood of God. He wrote an article, which is not in the book, The Prodigal Daughter. You should read it. Google it. It's there. You can read it. It's the female version of the prodigal son, but the implication is this is someone who God is someone who is forgiving and accepting and welcoming. So I think for me, as I imagine, Yancey alternates between the two.
Well, as I see the early Christians, their view of God was overwhelmingly loving Father. That was the image. It wasn't until 400 or 500 years afterward, when the church and the state began to align, that the image of God as stern judge became really prominent. And he became so prominent that that's when the veneration of Mary came about. It's like, whoa, you can't talk to him. Let's talk to mom. She knows how to get on his good side. And this was, I think I see Yancey as really loving the loving father image, but I need to fit the stern judge he scowls a lot, but I need to fit him in somehow. I mean, he's transitioned, Linda's right, but he's still, I gotta pay homage to this stern judge God.
So I want to leave you with two thoughts, and then we move to the question of sin and suffering. One is, we have the general view of God. God is love. Everybody says it. But then each of us has that private picture. And as you so rightly said, it evolves with our experiences over life. And I want to leave you with the thought, what is your personal image and your private image of God? As Adventists, many of us became Adventists through the evangelistic crusade, Daniel and Revelation and Sabbath is Saturday. It's all very doctrinal. And we could succumb to the temptation of being very doctrinal as opposed to being very personal. So ask yourself, what is your image? I want to tease you with two things. One is out of one of the March issue of The Economist. This is an obituary of a Frenchman, a Jew whose family moved to France and he grew up there. And he fought because he was a lawyer, because he felt the guillotine was a primitive and barbaric way of executing people. As a matter of fact, he felt capital punishment was barbaric, and he fought all his life in France till they abandoned the guillotine and removed capital punishment. That was his significant contribution to life. And as I read it, I thought, I wonder what his image of God might have been. Because so many of us as Christians have an image of God that blesses the status quo. Whatever the status quo is, we think that is what it is, as opposed to standing back and saying, how would God view this? How would love express itself? How can we balance the obligations? Which brings me to another story I got out of the New York Times. A gentleman by the name of Mike Favor, the drug addict, and the dog that saved his life in 2016 was a pit bull. And he has developed a whole community outreach because he says he, as a drug addict, a former drug addict, is a reject of society. And pit bulls are, generally speaking, a reject of society. So one reject another, and he works with drug addicts, helping them by adopting abandoned pit bulls. They didn't use the word ministry. I use the word ministry. And I think he's one of those people that Christ might say on that day, I was naked and you clothed me. I was hungry and you fed me. And he might say, are you kidding me? He has no image of God, so to speak, no picture in his mind of God. So the picture is not the important thing. It's what we do with the picture that is the important thing. If the picture leads us to positive hearing and compassion, it matters. If the picture doesn't lead us to positive hearing and compassion, then maybe the picture is useless. So it's important to think of the picture, but it's more important that you have a picture that motivates you to do something that shows hearing and compassion. Well, let's move quickly to sin. What is sin?
Just as we're transitioning, I grew up in California as a fourth generation Adventist. And the little church of my childhood, which is also my wife's church at the same time, was akin to Garrison Keillor's Lake Wobegon Church. It had the crazy people and it had the really holy people, and it was very small. But the image of God was very clear. It was perfection. And we're not doing enough. How do we grow? How did I grow from that to where I am today? And that's where you have to cross the street when it says don't cross. Sometimes in our theology, we have to think for ourselves and say, no, that can't be true. There must be another way. So I relate to the Bostonians a little bit. You live up there. That's normal.
Yes. We have to think our way through it. I want to talk about sin a little bit. What's the definition of sin? Sin, sorry.
1 John 3:4-6. Sin is the transgression of.
Sin is the transgression of the law. That's one definition. It's a legal definition. You break the law, you sin.
Anything that takes our eyes off Christ.
There's also a relational definition of sin. It's both. It's not one or the other. There's a relational definition that says when we break the relationship with God, in essence, we've taken our eyes off of Christ.
The first commandment.
A loss of love for God and an elevated self-love of ourselves is a definition for sin. And because of sin, we have a world of brokenness and of suffering. We live in a world of brokenness. We live in a world of destruction and suffering.
I'm sorry to speak again, but brokenness and suffering is not really a definition of sin. It's a result.
It's a consequence of sin.
I think sin is distrust of God.
Distrust, which would be a relational definition.
Yeah, it's distrust.
And the consequence, I'm sorry.
Think all defined. It says whatever is not of faith is sin, which whatever is not of belief is sin.
Right. Whatever is not of faith.
Relational.
Yes, it's relational. And the consequences, I'm sorry.
Well,
I'm hearing all this, but I think you have to be careful with the relational concept here because I know people who have no concept of God and will read what anyone looking at it would say, these are godly people. These people go out and serve the poor, serve people in jail, and do all kinds of things and don't know God. And how would you label them as living in sin?
And they make no profession of faith or God or anything.
How can that be sin?
Me.
Maybe it goes back to the original thing, it's the sin with they wanted to be like God without God.
Well, but I don't think they're denying God, they're just not aware.
They wanted to be God, but separate from, they thought they could do it without him. So they broke that covenantal relationship, I guess.
Okay,
I've kind of taken to the idea that there are levels of sin. According to what we know, in other words, and I remember talking about this in Sabbath school, in junior Sabbath school with Lawrence Maxwell. And the idea is, what do the people in the jungle who've never heard of God, can they sin? They've never heard of God. They don't have a Bible. But we are required to do up to what we know and what we have been given. We know the 10 Commandments, so there's no way that we can do any of these other things that the 10 Commandments said we shouldn't. But there are other people that maybe it's stealing part of the harvest of a garden, a common garden for the village. I don't know. I'm just saying, I think that there are levels of sin based on what you know and what your understanding is.
In James, it says all good things come from God. So good things come from God. Maybe they just haven't met him yet.
I think I want to go with this, that even if someone doesn't profess a belief in God, like this gentleman with the pit bulls, which I don't think he even talks about God. I think in showing caring and compassion, he's in that category where Jesus would say, come into the kingdom.
So I just want to say one more.
Sure.
All of those things may be true and probably are true. But what we all have to be careful of, in my personal view, is that, and Bob and I actually talked about it this week, is that these things are about sin and people are not binary. If you take that example that I gave, there's a lot of people in churches who will simply say, you're not a believer, you're a sinner. And you label and put them in the bucket.
And you should.
That's what we have to avoid out of all of that.
Bob, and then.
I think we have to say something like sin is a way of being that negates life. The reason we're drawn to these people who don't believe in God, but they treat people well. That's because they're acting in life-affirming ways. And that seems to be the essence of treating these dogs with compassion, treating the thirsty person, the hungry person. It's like, it's a way of being that says, no, your thirst matters to me. Here's some water. That's affirming life. And the reasons atheists oftentimes don't believe is they don't believe in the God of Christians who don't act that way.
Right.
So it's very logical what they're doing.
They're objecting to the private view of God that some of us project. And then.
In relation to good works, do we distinguish between philanthropy and righteousness?
Is there a difference between philanthropy and righteousness? Hold on,
I can do everything, right? But there's another aspect, being what we determine as right with God.
Yes. You were going.
I was just gonna say that a long time ago, I read a book, one of the many books from Ravi Zacharias, and this story just always stuck with me. And he told this story, and because of course he was Indian and Hindu and then became a Christian. But he told the story about this Indian girl who was so depressed and hopeless that she threw herself in front of a train and she lost her legs. And when she went to a hospital, she had a Christian nurse who started telling her about God. And she said, I always knew him, I just didn't know his name.
His name.
And that always stuck with me for people that, may not know God's name, but they're responding to I've written my laws on your heart.
Yes, I like that. And Tom,
Aside for me, sin is when what I want is more important than what God wants.
is worth more than what God wants,
What I want is more important than
than what God wants. So when we want to talk about sin and the consequences of sin, which is the broken world and suffering, I have found this book and I'm indebted to it. Rick Rice teaches at Loma Linda. It's a good read if you haven't read it. And I'm indebted to what I'm going to say from here on in about what Rick has said. So when we talk about sin and the consequences of sin, we're talking about suffering. It's more than just a theological term. It's a human experience that every one of us has. And he defines suffering as a physical ability, someone or something we love and lost, a career, an income, a serious illness, losing a job or one's ability to contribute to society. To suffer is to enter into a world that you've never known before. And I would wager there is not one person in this room who in one way or another hasn't experienced some form of suffering. And the questions that arise out of that are the questions, well, before we go there, let me just continue. So suffering is universal. The urge to make sense of suffering is universal. No response to suffering is entirely adequate, and suffering can shape your personal and private image of God. And that's why I put that as the advertisement for the lesson study today. What kind of world did God create? What kind of God created the world? What is God doing in the world? And what in the world is God doing? Because that's the challenge of suffering that every one of us faces. And over the course of our lives, we ask this question or some form of these questions. And that's the consequence of sin and suffering. And I got to tell you, as you get up in years, and I'm up in a few years now, it happens more frequently. Whenever I meet an old friend and we sort of rehearse, what happened to this one? What happened to that one? And it's kind of, oh, she passed away. This one has cancer. You know it. I don't have to rehearse it for you. We live in that world, and that's what we face. And the question that we have to ask ourselves and answer is, so how does God permit evil? And why does God permit evil? And how can we make sense of sin and suffering? And essentially, we have to answer the question why in some way, and we have to develop what I call a personal answer. Let's see, I jumped ahead. Well, we really jumped ahead now. Yeah. We have to develop a personal answer. Each of us has to develop a personal answer. And Rick Rice says there are three steps that help us, that help him, and I will say that have helped me. And I'd like to suggest to you this morning to develop a personal answer. One is a theory of suffering, which we'll talk about very briefly. The other is a reflection on the stories of people who have suffered and survived human experience. And the third is our religious faith. So, let me start first with the stories. Well, no. Let me see if we get it here. Let me start first with the stories. I have many. I don't know if I can share all of them, but let me tell you about mine. When I left Andrews back in 1969, I was going to the University of Toronto to do a doctoral degree in ethics and philosophy. I got there, and the conference said, "Si, we need a pastor of a small church. Why don't you postpone your doctoral degree for a year and pastor that district? And then you could go." So I went to the university and I asked them if they'd postpone to the fall of 1970, and they agreed. I took the little church. Actually, there were 3 churches. It was the largest geographic district in the Ontario-Quebec Conference. There were like 40 members in one church, 4 members in another church, 15 in a third. I had a little Volkswagen that was good on gas. I paid for travel. April 15, 1970, I got a phone call. "Si, your father has just died. He has been trapped in a building and burned to death." It was a Black Power revolution in Trinidad inspired by Mr. Fidel Castro, who wanted the oil that Trinidad has. So I just left everything, and Pat and I came down to Trinidad to take care of that. But it was very clear I wasn't going to be able to go to school in September of 1970. So I wrote the University of Toronto and asked them if they would postpone for another year to September of 1971. They agreed. I was building back the building because he owned it, was a commercial property. Pat was expecting my first boy, Nabi. I said, "Honey, go up and have the baby." We had insurance in Toronto, in Canada. "And I'll be there in time for the birth of the baby." I had another guest coming. She finally called me about 2 weeks later and said, "I'm coming home with your son," which she did. We finished the construction in 1971, but I couldn't get the building rented. So I wrote the university again and asked them if they'd postpone one third year. They agreed. And then the conference said to me, "Si, why are you just lingering around? Why don't you just stay and work with us? Become youth director of the conference." Finally gave up. I agreed. And my friend said, "You're giving up your doctoral degree?" And I said, "Yes, I am." All hopes. Because in those days, $3 Trinidad dollars equal $1 US. So once I agreed to work for 400 or 500 Trinidad dollars a month, the idea of raising money to go back to the States was just out of the question. So I came up, picked up my little washing machine that we had bought for $50. You know, those little English with the 2 rollers and a fridge and a radio, a stereo. Packed up, came down home, and we set up shop. 6 years, worked in the conference. And then the union said, "Why don't you become business manager of the college?" And I said, "Well, I could, but if I'm going to do that, I probably should get a business degree. Because one of these days there'll be a pharaoh who wouldn't recognize." So they said, "Okay, we'll even help you to get that business degree." So I came up to Andrews. And in the first quarter I was there, I discovered marketing. And it's kind of like, wait a minute. Marketing is to business what evangelism is to the church. How come we don't use marketing in the church? So I wrote the union and said, "I think I want to study marketing. So I'm not coming back." I'll figure it out. Mortgaged my hope that I had built in Trinidad, took a loan, and finished the master's. And then it's kind of like, where can I find a marketing program? I had no idea. And they said, well, one of the best programs is Chicago and Northwestern. I'll apply there. I applied there, I got accepted. And I went there, studied. And then Andrew said, why don't you come and teach here? Which I did. And Tom is the reason why I'm standing here today, because he had the idea of opening a college on the peninsula. And Greenlaw, who was the president, said, why don't you come and be academic dean? That brought me here. And I'm here today. It's a reasonably decent life, but it's been a painful one along the way with many stops. That's the story of people who have suffered and survived. And for me, the eternal God is my refuge, and underneath are the everlasting arms. He has led me through it. And Yvette was telling me about a young lady. She wouldn't let me show her picture, so I wouldn't do it. He invited her. She's a ballet dancer and a student at the college. And she invited Yvette and her friend Stephanie to come and see. She's teaching little girls to dance in the schools. And what's her story? She and her father and her brother and her grandmother were flying in a plane. Father was the pilot, crashed. Everyone died except her. She was severely injured. Physical therapy brought her back, and now she's teaching in schools, and she's committed to becoming a physical therapist. When I hear those stories of others and I reflect on the story of my life, I believe in a God who leads us through the valleys of the shadow of death. That's what we mean by the stories. When we talk about our religious faith, just to shift to the other, we're talking about the cross and we're talking about the resurrection. We're talking about Christ who did not want to go to that cross. And he asked his friends to pray with him, and he agonized and was painful, but he endured it. But suffering was not the end. He rose from the dead. And that is the story that we have to live with today. That suffering is not the end, that we can rise above that suffering. So, the area of suffering, where is sin and evil? Is it something that God does, or is it something that is a conflict between good and evil? We believe it is a conflict between good and evil. And as a result, good will prevail and suffering will end. Which brings me to the final conclusion. What is your image of God? God is Lord and God is love. Suffering is real and suffering is wrong. God is with us when we suffer, and suffering never has the last word. There will come a day, in spite of the suffering that we and our friends experience, there will come a day when we will say, O death, where is thy sting? O grave, where is thy victory? Why was sin permitted? We have probed the topic just a little bit. We have scratched the surface. We've attempted to answer the questions. We've drawn on the cross and the resurrection. I will say there is no easy answer. However, you ask what kind of God permitted sin and suffering? That question, each of us must answer for ourselves. For me, my answer is, the Lord is my shepherd and father, the eternal one, and underneath are the everlasting arms. Let's pray. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for your leading and your guidance. We thank you for the faith you've given to each of us. We ask, Lord, that we would, Lord, discover a real image of who you are and through the cut and trust of human experience and our own, help us to find a way to show care and compassion, thoughtfulness and kindness to our fellow human beings, friends, and our neighbors. And may we on that day hear the words, "Well done." We ask this in Jesus' name. God bless you. Have a happy Sabbath. And I apologize. Carolyn is to blame for my.